Hello everyone, welcome back to our study of the Law of Moses. Now, if you just clicked into this video on YouTube, the title of today's video probably sounds super boring. Liability and use of movable property. And I'm sorry for that. That's just what it is. We're talking about a pretty broad collection of laws that answer a few really big questions, like what happens when you or your property damages someone else or their property? What are you obligated to do on behalf of your neighbor with regards to his property? What are the limits of what you are allowed to do with your own property? So there's just some pretty big questions, and to try to fit all of that into something, is just pithy as a YouTube video title. Really the best description is what we've got. We're talking about liability, and we're talking about the use of your property that is not your land. Because last week we talked about the land. We focused last week in Exodus chapter 22, and we're going to return there this week. We're going to pick up basically where we left off in Exodus 22. And we're going to start looking at liability in the law. Exodus chapter 22, verses 14 and 15. If a man borrows anything of his neighbor, and it is injured or dies, the owner not being with it, he shall make full restitution. If the owner was with it, he shall not make restitution. If it was hired, it came for its hiring fee. Now, notice this is again picking right up after the theft laws that we talked about last week. These are related questions of justice here, whether you are stealing your neighbor's stuff or just being negligent with your neighbor's stuff so that it ends up being destroyed or dying. All right, so here you're not taking your neighbor's property again by theft, but it's still a matter of how you're treating your neighbor's property and ultimately your neighbor, because the way that you treat your neighbor's stuff is really closely related to how you're treating your neighbor. Now, this law distinguishes between when the animal is in your sole care versus when the owner is with you. Your neighbor's there supervising you as you are borrowing his animal. That's the most common use of this law, by the way, with regards to animals, but it's broadly applicable to anything that you're borrowing from your neighbor. The point of the distinction in the law is that your neighbor is still responsible for what happens to his own stuff while he's there to supervise its use. But when your neighbor is not there, you're the one who's supposed to take care of it, right? You become responsible for what happens to it. This should be completely intelligible to us today. There's nothing foreign in the thinking of this law. I want us to notice this passage continues that same language that is used in the theft laws and in the land liability laws that we looked at a couple of weeks ago. That if anything happens, you have to make restitution. Now, we're going to have more to say about that word restitution later on, whenever we're talking about spiritual applications of the law. But for now, we just need to understand that you are responsible for repaying your neighbor if you damage or destroy his stuff while you're borrowing it and while he's not with you. Now, the law contains plenty of other liability statutes as well. We're going to look at two statutes just a little bit earlier. We're going to go to the end of Exodus chapter 21. We're going to start in verse 33. When a man opens a pit, or when a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restoration. He shall give money to its owner, and the dead beast shall be his. When one man's ox butts another's so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and share its price, and the dead beast also they shall share. Or if it is known that the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has not kept it in, he shall repay ox for ox, and the dead beast shall be his. All right, so here the standard of restitution differs from what we've seen in Exodus chapter 22, but the basic principle is still there. Right? If you or your property causes harm to your neighbor or to his property, then you must pay restitution. Now, there are more laws here just right in this area of Exodus 21 that we could look at. We're gonna cover some more of them in greater detail later on, because some of these are capital cases, right? Whenever we're talking about your ox, not just goring your neighbor's animal, but your neighbor, right? Goring somebody else. What's your responsibility in those cases? We're going to talk about violence specifically as its own topic later on in our class. So we'll be talking about murder and manslaughter and things like that. We'll cover this in more detail there because one of those cases turns into a capital offense. But we should know, again, generally, you are responsible. And particularly if your property causes harm to your neighbor's property. So you've got an ox who gores your neighbor's animal, or you have dug out a pit and your neighbor's animal falls into it. You're responsible for that. You have to make restitution. Again, not really a foreign concept to us. So these are pretty easy, basic concepts. Where things start to get foreign to our thinking is that the law of Moses goes beyond this. Like what we've been talking about is what we would consider basic liability, right? If you're responsible for some kind of damage, you have to repay the damage. But the law of Moses goes beyond that. We're going to skip ahead just a little bit into Exodus chapter 23. We're going to start in verse 4. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall bring it back to him. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying down under its burden, you shall refrain from leaving him with it. You shall rescue it with him. Now, this is not liability in the sense that we're used to talking about liability, in the sense that we've been talking about it in the class so far, where you have to pay restitution for damage done to your neighbor or to your neighbor's goods. Instead, you are obligated to restore your neighbor's property to him if you have the ability, or even if you had nothing to do with his property getting into the condition that it's in. All right, now we saw earlier, if you're borrowing an animal from your neighbor and he's there supervising you, it's ultimately his responsibility. But here, we have a different circumstance, right? You come across an animal on the road that is either lost, right? You had nothing to do with that, we hope, right? We've already covered laws that deal with that, but you come across it lost. That's not, in our thinking, that's not your responsibility. Or you come across this animal that's overburdened, right? Again, you're not the one that laid the burden on it, but the law obligates you in both of those cases to help the guy who owns that animal. The law holds Israelites responsible for rendering aid, and not just to their neighbors, but even to their enemies. You see the way that law was framed, right? It's not just your neighbor, it's your enemy. If you see your enemy's ox or donkey going astray, you shall bring it back to him. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying down under its burden, you shall refrain from leaving him with it. Right? In other words, you've got to not only help your enemy out, but you've actually got to do it with him there in some circumstances. Right? Where he's obviously the one who's responsible for overloading this donkey. And the law says if you come across this man on the road and you see him in the midst of that folly, it is your obligation to help him. You don't just leave him there with it. You shall rescue the donkey with him. So here we see the law foresees the kind of smart aleck question that the lawyer asked Jesus, right? Who is my neighbor? It just cuts right to the chase. Even if you see your enemy, the guy who hates you, you help him out. You're under obligation for that. Now, if we look at the parallel command in Deuteronomy chapter 22, we can see that the obligation is even more expansive than that. right? So again, you are not just obligated to restore things to your neighbor that you have lost and that you have destroyed. You're obligated to restore them when he's lost them, when he's threatening to destroy his own property. It's your job, your obligation to try to restore that to him, and not just your neighbor, but even your enemy. But it gets even more expansive than that. Deuteronomy chapter 22, we're going to read the first 4 verses. You shall not see your brother's ox or his sheep going astray and ignore them. You shall take them back to your brother. And if he does not live near you, and you do not know who he is, you shall bring it home to your house. It shall stay with you until your brother seeks it. Then you shall restore it to him. And you shall do the same with his donkey, or with his garment, or with any lost thing of your brother's, which he loses and you find. You may not ignore it. You shall not see your brother's donkey or his ox fallen down by the way and ignore them. You shall help him to lift them up again. All right, so the law expands the obligation out to anything that belongs to another. All right, so not just an ox, not just a donkey, anything. All right, now Israel should have been able to understand this from the law in Exodus 23, but here it's made explicit. Anything. You find anything that doesn't belong to you, it's your responsibility to take care of it, and furthermore, take care of it until such a time as the owner comes around to claim it. That's a completely open-ended obligation. Right, that's a Good Samaritan type obligation that the law gives you. You find some random herd animal just out in the wilderness. You have no idea who it belongs to. It's your job to take it in. Your job to feed that animal and protect that animal, to keep that animal for whoever it belongs to. And how long do you do it? Until he comes around for it. Again, completely open-ended. So, to sum up, the basic principle of liability under the law, again, is that you're responsible for your own stuff, but you're also responsible for your neighbor's stuff, and not just what you do to your neighbor's stuff, but also to what your neighbor does to your neighbor's stuff. All right, it's essentially, we can hear echoes through this of Cain's question to God, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Right, and right, I don't want to derail this topic to hunt down that question as fully as it deserves. But in this regard, the clear answer is yes. Right? You find, again, your neighbor, your brother, the guy who hates you. If he does something dumb, you don't just stand by and snigger. So, look at that dumb guy. He's overloaded his ox, or his ox has fallen over. He can't keep his ox penned in. His sheep's running around out in the wilderness. And again, you don't just get to claim that animal and say, "Oh, you know what? Here's another one for my herds or for my flocks." It's your job to take care of it and then to give it back once the owner comes around. So, you're responsible. You clean up messes. All right, that's your job. That's what you're under obligation to do. So, that's, again, just a brief look at liability under the law. The next topic we're going to look at is limitations on what you can do with your own stuff. Now, this is also going to be pretty brief. In fact, I think today's class in total is going to be pretty brief. But this section is going to be brief because we've seen some of these laws already. We've already seen some of these principles at work also in the use of the land, right? So we know already that the law does not take this position that, hey, if it's your stuff, you can do whatever you want with it. It does not take that position at all. You're not free to do whatever you want with your own land. Right? When it comes to your land, for example, you have to leave a certain amount of your crop unharvested. Right? You're not allowed to harvest it at all, and it's there for the protected classes. And then whatever part you do harvest, you're not allowed to go through a second time and take the gleanings. The gleanings have to be left for the protected classes. All right, so that principle, we've already learned that principle, and we're not going to be surprised by anything that we see concerning other types of property. You are not at liberty to do as you please with your stuff. There are hard limits on what you can do. So let's start with two related statutes that we've already covered under the cleanliness laws. We're going to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 10 and 11. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. You shall not wear cloth of wool and linen mixed together. All right, two different statutes that are closely related. They have a moral basis in the cleanliness laws, right? The concern is holiness, as we talked about during that class. That's why we covered them under the cleanliness laws, because the concern is a holiness concern. But these are also property laws. And your clothing, that's your property. And more than likely, you or a relative of yours is making it. And the law tells you you can't just have whatever you want. Right? When it comes to what you wear, in particular, you can't have mixed fabrics, mixed fibers. It has to be of one type. Whenever it comes to your animals, your work animals, you are not allowed to do just whatever you want with them. Or here the specific restriction is you don't plow with an ox and a donkey together. Now, again, we said this is based in holiness, right? So obviously holiness trumps ownership rights. So whenever it comes to the stuff that you own, again, anything that violates principles of holiness, that trumps your ownership rights. You don't get to say, well, you know what? So what if this is unholy in the sight of God? This is my stuff. I'm going to do what I want with it. That much I feel is fairly obvious. But there's also here in this law likely a concern for the health of the ox and the donkey, since. Well, and in fact, this is the way, if I remember correctly, some of the rabbinic commentaries on this law take this angle. Not only is it a holiness concern, it is also an animal well-being concern, we could say. Because plowing with unequal animals almost certainly leads to one of them being injured, right? Because they're going to be yoked together. Now, we'll find this kind of concern for the well-being of your property. We're going to see it paralleled in some of the slave laws that we're going to cover next week. So we know that concern is there in the law. And you don't just get to mistreat and abuse your property. Well, we find that also reflected in the Proverbs, right? That you know a lot about a man based on how he cares for his animals. But we also find this concern with abuse in the fourth commandment. All right, since we're in Deuteronomy, let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 5. We'll get the 10 commandments there. We're going to read just the fourth commandment, Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 through 15. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son, or your daughter, or your male servant, or your female servant, or your ox, or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Now, there's all kinds of laborers mentioned in the fourth commandment. The only one that is not explicitly your property in the ancient world was the sojourner. Right? The rest of them that are named, they are, at least in an ancient context, they are explicitly your property. right? That includes not just the ox and the donkey and the livestock. That doesn't just include your male and female slaves, because that's, the ESV renders that servant. What we're talking about is slaves. Those clearly in an ancient context, those are all your property, but also your kids are your property. Remember, the idea that people can be property is very, very common. That's the norm in antiquity. Basically, everybody in your household is your property if you are the father of the household. That includes your wife, too. And so the law covers all of these laborers. So it's not just you that's forbidden from working on the Sabbath, but also all of your property. Your son, your daughter, male servant, female servant, ox, donkey, livestock. And again, the sojourner is the only one who is not explicitly your property in the ancient world. Though, as we see in the stories of Genesis, sojourners are often treated as functional property. You think back to the story of Jacob and Laban, right? There's all kinds of layers of rottenness to that story, the way that Laban treats Jacob. Laban shouldn't be treating Jacob like a foreigner to begin with, because they're kin. But Laban does treat Jacob like a foreigner, and he mistreats him, even by their standards for how they're to treat foreigners, because Jacob becomes, again, functionally Laban's property. And you remember the showdown, the confrontation that they have there at the end. After Jacob flees, Laban chases him down and accuses him of stealing his well, it starts with the sons of Laban accusing Jacob of stealing their livestock. And whenever Laban catches up with him, Laban accuses him of stealing his daughters. Right? You go back and you read through that story, and Jacob has all of that fair and square. Right? Jacob is a cheat, certainly, but in those circumstances, regarding those particular things, Jacob has those things fair and square, and Laban is making these accusations against him because he feels like he can treat him like he is his property. The Sabbath law forbids you from using any of your property for labor on the Sabbath day. Right? It doesn't matter that they belong to you. It doesn't matter that they are under your power. You may not make them labor on the Sabbath. And it's not just a holiness concern, right? It's not just about protecting the sanctity of the Sabbath. There's that there. But you look at the way that it's framed, right? Let's see, your male servant and your female servant shall rest as well as you, right? In other words, they're going to receive decent treatment, like I'm giving you, God says. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Right, again, the concern here is not just for the sanctity of the Sabbath. Israel ought to have sympathy and solidarity with all of those that they own, and with the sojourners who live with them. They remember what it was like to be property, because they were property, and they did not receive a rest, and they cried out to God for it. All right, so on the Sabbath day, they ought to remember what it was like to be property, to belong to somebody else, to be worked. And they ought to extend the mercy to their property that God has extended to them. Because, again, remember, that's what the Sabbath is for. The Sabbath is made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Right? The way that Deuteronomy frames the Sabbath law here, of course, fits perfectly with the way that Jesus describes it in the Gospels. So let's wrap up this week. And I know this is clocking in at a relatively short video this week. But let's wrap up by looking at some spiritual applications for these property laws. First, I want to look at the way that the law obligates you to your neighbor. And we saw that the liability laws go beyond just cleaning up messes of your own making. Right? In his teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus rejects the principle of retribution, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And in that teaching, Jesus broadens his scope out to address matters of obligation, right? So he's not just talking about punishments for violence. He doesn't just say, turn the other cheek. He then broadens the argument out. Starting in Matthew chapter 5, verse 40. If anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you. Do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. Right? And we find this principle reflected also in Luke's account of the sermon in Luke chapter 6. Again, give to those who beg from you. Right? Give more than you are technically required, more than you're asked. Right? The consistent teaching of God is that we are obligated beyond just what natural law might tell us that we're obligated to, right? It makes natural sense for me to have to restore someone's property that I have damaged or destroyed. I think practically all cultures through all history have come up with that principle. You restore what you are responsible for damaging and destroying. But the law and the Gospels give us an obligation beyond what natural law requires. Right? If someone forces you to go 1 mile, you go 2. If somebody begs from you, don't refuse. Right? If someone would borrow from you, give it to them. If somebody wants to take your tunic, give them your cloak too. Whatever you are obligated to do, go beyond that, the gospel says. And find ways to be giving in ways that you are not naturally obligated to. Right? This really strikes against the modern idea that I'm only responsible for my own actions. That's a huge talking point in American culture. Right? We see it, we've seen it trotted out just this past week as, we've been talking about race relations in this country. We've been talking about, just in the wake of what happened to George Floyd. We've been talking about the treatment of minorities in this country. We've been talking about what our obligations are. Right? How do we make things right today? And you will hear a chorus of people, many of whom claim Christ, many of whom are in the church, members of the church, many of whom are brothers, will trot out this, it's a worldly talking point. I'm only responsible for what happens to me. Right? I'm not the one who owned slaves. Right, I don't have any ancestors who owned slaves. Fill in the blank. That argument develops in several different directions. Right, but ultimately, it's not my responsibility. That's not the biblical attitude. Right, I don't want to camp out on this, but I want us to consider the way that the law and the Gospels invite us to consider obligation, responsibility, our duty to help others, to clean up messes not of our own making. It's just not an argument that we can make to say, look, nothing is required of me. I only answer for what I've done. I'm only responsible for my own actions. Right? That's just, biblically speaking, doesn't have a leg to stand on. Now, we also saw, passing on to another spiritual application of the law, we also saw that the law militates against this idea that you treat your neighbor one way, but you treat your enemy another way. We saw 2 parallel laws where they're stating the same principle. One of them frames it in terms of your brother, the other frames it in terms of your enemy. You don't treat them differently. Jesus repeats this, of course, in the parable of the Good Samaritan, but he also covers it in the Sermon on the Mount, if we pick up right where we left off in Matthew chapter 5. Verse 43, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies, and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." All right, so you don't treat your neighbor, you don't treat your enemy differently than you treat anybody else. Again, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. If you see the man who hates you struggling with something, help him. All right, we'll pass on to one final lesson, one final thing that I want to consider. What it means to restore something under the law. Now, we said that we'd have more to say about this word restitution. We saw it in several places. We'll pick it up from Exodus chapter 22, verse 14. There we see that if someone borrows his neighbor's property and destroys it, quote, "he shall make full restitution," end quote. In Hebrew, it's really simple. Shalem yishalem. He shall make full restitution, or surely he shall make him whole. The word that's used here twice, shalem yishalem, is none other than shalom, or the word that we often translate peace. Because the idea of making someone whole, restoring something to someone, making restitution, is part and parcel with the biblical concept of peace. I'm looking at the camera here, and it looks like it might be lagging behind me a little bit. We'll see. We'll see how things turn out in post. Who knows? I forgot to mention this at the beginning of the class. This is another experiment with some different technology here. Sudden interruption for just a second. It's me without the bow tie. Ironically, at this point in the video, things start to fall apart from a technical standpoint. So I need to fill in just a little bit here that that my laptop could just completely dropped. I want us to consider at this point. So shalom, remember, is wholeness, completeness, making someone whole. We just saw that it's making restitution or restoring something. And I want us to consider the implications that this has for our readings of the New Testament, our readings of the Gospel. Think especially of what Jesus says in the Beatitudes. Matthew chapter 5, verse 9, he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." And it's really easy to breeze through that and say, oh, peace, I don't fight with anybody. Yeah, I'm a peacemaker, son of God, right here. And we have to stop and give ourselves a reality check here. Biblically speaking, what's it mean to make peace? It doesn't just mean to stop fighting. It means to make people whole. That's what it means to be a peacemaker. That's why, by the way, fairly early on in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus teaches this in Matthew chapter 5, verse 23. "If you're offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift." All right, so the Gospels, the Sermon on the Mount makes this paramount. Make peace with your brother. And it's talking about this in the context of a disagreement. All right, where one of you is angry with the other for some reason, but where it goes from here is talking about, look, go and settle this out quickly, or you're going to be taken to court. Every last penny's going to be taken from you. This is a matter of restorative justice, as it were. It's a matter of shalom. right? In this disagreement, it's not just, hey, you go to your brother and you say, hey, I'm sorry, stop being mad at me. No, you go make things right? You make amends, which means, again, restoring whatever it is that you have wronged your brother in. And Jesus says that's so important that even trumps formal worship. That's so important. All right, so I don't know how much of the end of this video has gotten corrupted. I might send you back over to Bowtied, Caleb, to wrap things up here, just depending on how much of the video I'm able to recover. But if not, then I just want to close this out here and say next week we are going to begin studying what the law of Moses has to say about slaves. And yeah, it's going to be an awkward and uncomfortable study. And yeah, we are going to touch on American slavery because a lot of apologists for the Confederacy, for American slavery, get absolutely garbage arguments that they think are based in the law of Moses and that they think are based in the New Testament, when they have no understanding about how things worked in antiquity and what the law of Moses is trying to do with the institution of slavery as it existed in antiquity. So I think, I hope that you'll be surprised by what we find in the law of Moses. And just like we said earlier, just remember that in antiquity, that mindset that you are able to own other people it's everywhere. That's what everybody believes in antiquity. And the law of Moses actually goes a long way towards remedying that with the laws that it puts in place. So look forward to seeing everybody next week, and hopefully by then we'll be able to have some of these camera problems sorted out. So until next time, bye-bye.